seek the United States as a security partner of choice.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that very much. Now, my time has expired, but I'd like to just ask one more question. You made the statement we should cease to be cautious about the language we use to describe these activities. Can you define that a little bit for us?
I'm not sure in what context you're referring to.
Okay, that was a quote, and I'll do that for the record and give you the context,
okay.
Because it's something that a lot of us didn't understand.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Admiral, thank you for your service, and you are certainly in the center of the action. Let me just reiterate here what you've said. You said that the Korean leader is intent on accomplishing his goals as a nuclearized nation. His goal is a nuclear warhead. These are my words, but I think it's what you meant. Married to an ICBM that would have the capability of getting to the U.S. And you said it's not, in your opinion, not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Is that a correct interpretation of what you've said?
It is correct, sir.
Okay. And you also offered your opinion that you would not bet that China can basically deter the DPRK. Is that correct?
Yeah. To be clear, I felt in the past that China, though it had has the capability to influence and affect North Korean behavior for a number of reasons, it had chosen not to exert the full range of its influence. And I think we're in a different place now. I think the jury's out. It's early days. We'll have to see if China has changed its view of its willingness to influence KJU.
Based on their previous activity, there's no indication that you think that that's going to occur, although you're hopeful.
Well, right, sir. I mean, past performance is no indicator of future productivity. So up to a month or two ago, I would agree with that statement completely. After all, I made the statement. So, from a month ago forward, I mean, we're seeing some positive behavior from China, and I'm encouraged by that. So I think we should let this thing play out a little bit and see where it goes. Now, part of that, though, Kim Jong Un and the North Korean regime, they can't do something precipitative in the intervening period to test us. So we have to be careful and sensitive to that as well.
Precisely. So up to this point, has China done anything that would give you an indication that they are going to be helpful to the U.S. in getting the leader to back off of his intent to nuclearize an ICBM?
Sir, I don't know for a fact what China has done in the last month or so. I know that they are active in working the problem set, but I don't know the specifics of what they've done. All I see are the activities that Kim Jong Un has done, in the last month or so.
And that is still on his march to nuclearize ICBM.
I think it is, though in the last month he has not tested a nuclear weapon. So he's tested 5 this century, and he hasn't tested a 6th. He has not launched an ICBM in the last month or ever. So I don't know if there's a cause and effect, or whether it just didn't fit his schedule.
Right.
So, again, it's early days on this, so I think we would be best served to see if this has a positive outcome or not, and let President Xi and work this issue as he and the president said he agreed they would.
Sure. But if China doesn't deter him, there's only one deterrence left, and that's the U.S. Kinetic action. Is that what it looks like?
I don't want to say that there's only that option left. I think if China's efforts fails, then we're back to where we were, status quo ante, if you will, to try to throw some Latin in there. And at that point, and then as the president has said, all options are on the table. And I think he means just that, all options are on the table. So my job in that framework is to provide military options, but there are other options, I'm sure, and I would leave it to those experts to come up with those options. But my options are hard power options.
And your hard power options, you need additional materiel.
I need additional materiel in the long run, but that's not to suggest that the hard power options that the U.S. military can provide the president would not be effective tonight, and they would be effective tonight if called upon to execute them.
Final question. There was a report in the Washington Post, I think it was David Ignatius, several weeks ago, in essence saying that the failures of the North Korean launches are directly attributable to the U.S. Is that anything that you want to talk about here?
No, sir, it's not anything I want to talk about here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Admiral Harris, thank you for being here. As PACOM commander, did you participate in authoring the 2016 Force Structure Assessment?
I participated in the run-up to that.
Okay.
Right.
Well, the Force Structure Assessment called for a 355 ship Navy, and in that regard, I want to follow up on a
national
line of
senior
questions.
leaders. Can you discuss how the ISR enables your operations in PACOM region and also in relation to the Korean Peninsula specifically?
Yes, ma'am, and I'll try to stay on the right side of the classification here without getting into too many specifics. But ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, is the term that we apply to our ability to watch our adversaries. And we want to watch them all the time. But there's not enough ISR to go around to meet all of the requirements of all of the combatant commanders. So I've stated my requirements. This is like the submarine discussion. Central Command, who's fighting the fight today in the Middle East, AFRICOM, and North Africa, and so on, they have their requirements for ISR also. So it comes out of a pool, and all the services contribute to the pool in different ways. And so I don't have what I need. I don't have the ability to persistently watch my adversaries all over the Indo-Asia Pacific, over half the globe, 24/7. And I need it 24/7. I need it in whatever 60 times 24 hours is. I need it that minute by minute, and I don't have that. And that's what General Scaparrotti was getting at with persistent ISR. And I'm convinced that today, even though he's the European commander, he would like more ISR as well.
Can you give us some kind of idea on what percentage of those requirements you have fulfilled? Do you have half? Do you have two-thirds?
No, I probably have a tenth of my requirements are fulfilled.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Admiral Harris, for your testimony here today. Admiral Harris, you referenced in your written testimony that 9 out of 10 megacities in the world are in the Pacific Command's area of responsibility, and certainly given our conversation here today, Seoul is in the front and center of what we're talking about. It is my understanding that the number of megacities in the world is expected to expand in the coming years, and I expect that growth will continue in the Indo-Asian Pacific theater as well. And I'm concerned, as well as I know a number of other folks, that our military isn't adequately prepared for operations in megacities, whether it's to fight or is to assist in humanitarian assistance or disaster relief missions. So I'd like your opinion, Admiral, on how we should conduct training, and do you believe that additional training, particularly with the Army and Marine Corps, should focus on operations within megacities?
Thanks, sir. And just to be clear, in that 9 of 10, I stole a city from Jove Hotel.
Yeah.
One of those cities is Karachi, Pakistan, which is in his AOR, but right next to mine.
Right.
So I believe the Army and the Marine Corps are getting after this issue of fighting in heavily urban terrains. I believe that they need to continue to do that for the reasons you've outlined, but also we're working with our allies and friends in the region to improve their capability at the same time that we work to improve our capability to fight in those dense urban environments.
Admiral House, as you know, China's One Belt, One Road strategy seeks to secure China's control over its continental and maritime interests with the hopes of dominating Eurasia and exploiting natural resources for future economic gains. Such designs place the country at odds with the United States, but also nations like Japan and India. And currently, China's economy and budget is 4 times greater than those of India. I want to talk a little bit about India and its importance to us. However, India is an ambitious and growing country, both in population and its economy. China and India naturally have competing interests at stake on the continent and adjoining maritime domain. India has expressed concerns over China's recent expansion into the South China Sea and perceived strategic goals in our region. Also, given the fact that India is a democracy, certainly shares many values with us here in the United States. I'd be curious as to how you view India's role in the future in the Indo-Pacific region and what we should be doing to strengthen that relationship, and if there's anything in particular that you would like to see expanded so that we can work more closely with our friends in India.
Thanks, sir. I've made India a formal line of effort at Pacific Command because I believe it represents a tremendous opportunity for the United States writ large and for PACOM in particular in the mill-to-mill space. We share democratic values with India. We're the world's 2 largest democracies. We share cultural values with Indian Americans that live and work and lead in our country. And I think that in the mill-to-mill space, we're in a very good place and getting better. India is purchasing a lot of American equipment. The world's 2nd largest C-17 fleet, for example, is Indian. The Indians have P-8 Poseidon aircraft, U.S. helicopters, howitzers, and on and on. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think we should continue to work that. We are heavily involved, when I say we, the Navy is heavily involved in working with the Indians on the development of their aircraft carrier, their indigenous aircraft carrier. And that's an exciting program. And I think that India's geostrategic interests align perfectly with ours in terms of being concerned about China and in terms of the interaction or the intersection, rather, of China and India, including along their long land border, but especially in the Indian Ocean, especially in the approaches to the Indian Ocean, the Andaman Islands and the like. So I welcome an improved relationship with India. They've invited me twice in the last 2 years to speak at their Raisina dialogue, which I've accepted, and I want to continue to improve and grow the relationship between our 2 countries.
Thank you, Admiral.
Admiral, welcome back, and thanks to you and all the men and women you lead in Pacific Command. I want to talk today about relative strength of missile forces in the Indo-Pacific, given the vast distances in that theater. Missiles are a critical component of any country's security, including ours. How many of China's land-based missile forces do you estimate have a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers?
In an unclassified venue, Senator, over 90%. Over 90% fall in that range.
And how many missiles do you have that fall into that range?
I have none, sir.
You have none?
Right.
Why do you have none?
Because that range, 500 to 5,500 kilometers, is defined in the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which prohibits nuclear and cruise missiles and ICBMs, or nuclear and conventional cruise and ICBMs, or ballistic missiles in that range. And we adhere to the INF Treaty religiously, as we should. It's a treaty that we signed on for. China is not a signatory to the treaty, so they're not obliged to follow that treaty, and we can't legitimately, in my opinion, criticize China for developing weapons that contravene the treaty because they did not sign on to it.
Because the only two parties to the treaty are Russia and the United States.
That's correct. And there's some successor states from the Soviet Union that the treaty applies. But it's really us and Russia are the signatories to the treaty. General Selva just testified recently that Russia has violated the treaty in the conventional sense with a conventional cruise missile. And so at the end of the day, what you have is you have a treaty that binds theoretically two countries, one of which violates it without being held to account. The other adheres to it rigidly as it should. And then all the other countries in the world are not obliged to follow the treaty, and they don't. And those countries that are of concern, of course, are China and my region and Iran in jumbo tails.
Well, since you mentioned General Silva's testimony, I think this is what you're referring to. He spoke to the House Armed Services Committee last month in which he said the Russians have deployed a land-based cruise missile that violates the spirit and intent of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and they do not intend to return to compliance. Is that what you're referring to?
It was, sir.
And you agree with that assessment?
I do.
And the INF Treaty was originally reached between the United States and the Soviet Union after the buildup of first Soviet forces in the late 70s and then our own forces along with NATO in 1983. And so it's geared primarily towards the European theater. Is that correct?
It was geared toward the Soviet Union, Senator, in a bipolar world. This was at the height of the Cold War, and now we're in a multipolar world where we have a lot of countries that are developing these weapons, including China, that I worry about. And I worry about their DF-21 and DF-26 missile programs, their anti-carrier ballistic missile programs, if you will. INF doesn't address missiles launched from ships or airplanes, but it focuses on those land-based systems. I think there's goodness in the INF treaty. Anything you can do to limit nuclear weapons writ large is a general good, probably. But the aspects of the INF treaty that limit our ability to counter Chinese and other countries' cruise missiles, land-based missiles, I think is problematic.
And as you say, since the United States and Russia are the only two parties to the treaty, and you and General Silva and several other U.S. government officials have said that Russia is violating the treaty, that means the United States is the only country in the world that unilaterally refuses to build missiles that have a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers.
That is correct.
Do you think that we should consider renegotiating or withdrawing from the treaty or declaring Russia a material breach?
I would never advocate unilateral withdrawing from the treaty because of the nuclear limitation part of it. But I do think we should look at renegotiating the treaty. We should consider that because, as you say, there's only two countries that signed on to it, and one of them doesn't follow it, and so that becomes a unilateral limitation on us.
So one final question then. There's three scenarios. One is Russia comes back into compliance. The United States and Russia comply. Two is we somehow withdraw from or abrogate or declare Russia a material breach, so we are no longer unilaterally controlled, or we continue the status quo where we unilaterally are the only country that refuses to develop those missiles. Surely, whatever you think between 1 and 2, we can't accept 3 going forward, can we?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the chairman, Senator Warren, please.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for being here, Admiral Harris. In your posture statement last year, you described the Asia-Pacific rebalance as, quote, a strategic whole of government effort that guides and reinforces our military efforts, integrating with diplomatic, political, and economic initiatives. You still agree with that statement, Admiral?
I do, ma'am. We labeled it the rebalance in the previous administration, and in the early days of the previous administration, we labeled it the pivot.
Yes.
I think the labeling of whatever it is we do is less important than the whatever it is we do.
And that's actually the part I wanted to focus on, because I agree with you on this. And I just have a simple question right here, and that is whether or not funding cuts to agencies that conduct diplomacy and development and perform other civilian functions would make your job easier or more difficult.
I believe it would make it more difficult. I'm reminded of what famous French Foreign Minister Talleyrand said, the head of the French Army, Marshal Ney. He said, when my profession fails, yours must come to the rescue. I think that we're not in a good place if we're that bifurcated, but also I believe that if the State Department fails earlier because of funding, then we'll have to, quote unquote, come to the rescue sooner.
Yeah.
And I'd rather, push that off to the right rather than bring it to the left.
Yeah, that's a very powerful point. I just want to note for the record that the Trump administration in its budget blueprint calls for about a 29% cut to the State Department and significant cuts to other agencies with international responsibilities. Obviously, there is a strong military component to the Asia-Pacific and keeping us safe there, but as you say, it takes a lot more in this vital region to keep us safe. So I want to shift, if I can, to North Korea. We are dealing here with a real threat from a dangerous, unstable, nuclear-armed state. And despite tough sanctions, North Korea continues to be provocative. I'm concerned that this is a brewing crisis that would escalate without warning. We went over to the White House yesterday, and the administration said again that the time for strategic patience is over. Now, I think it's still not clear precisely what their new strategy is. By all accounts, North Korea is continuing its efforts to develop a nuclear-armed interballistic missile system that could reach the continental U.S. coastline. And in recent days, administration officials have talked about shooting down a North Korean ballistic missile test. So, Admiral, could you talk a little bit about the strategic considerations that we must take into account before taking such an action? What are the upsides and downsides to shooting down one of their test missiles here?
Well, there's a capability issue. There's a geometry issue of where that missile is going, and all of that. So, if they're launching a test missile that we think is going to land in Korea or Japan, then I think we're obligated to do what we can.
I understand that, but just shooting down a test missile in general. As I understand it, what I've been trying to read about this, experts on North Korea's war plans say that Kim Jong Un would likely respond to U.S. military action with massive escalation against South Korea, Japan, perhaps even the United States, if we shot down a test missile. So I'm just asking, do you agree with that assessment? And if so, how is it that the administration should take this dynamic into account as it formulates its North Korea policy?
A lot of what you're asking, Senator, is being deliberated in the administration now. And I'm in a difficult position when asked to comment on ongoing process deliberations. So I'm going to defer on that. But I will say that there are if we don't maintain credible combat power to confront Kim Jong Un's testing and his development goals, then we're going to be in a position to be blackmailed by KJU, and I think that's probably a worse place to be. And I think that we'll all agree that everything that's been done up to this point has not worked in deterring Kim Jong Un. So all of the military capabilities that we have, all of our alliances and all of that have not deterred Kim Jong Un's desires to achieve a nuclear weapon that can reach the United States. So we must stop that somehow.
Well,
and so those options I think, are on the table. All of those options are on the table.
The somehow, though, is the question, and I see that I'm out of time, so I'm going to quit here, and we can continue this conversation later. But that's precisely the question we're trying to ask about, and why it is that I'm asking the question about what the upsides and downsides are if we take action directly on one of these testing missiles, whether or not it escalates. And this gives him provocation to invade South Korea, to bomb Japan, otherwise. And so,
I think that he has he can manufacture whatever provocation he wants to attack South Korea or Japan or us. I think that the manufacture of provocations it resides with him.
I appreciate that. But I have to say on this one, Admiral, I think that we need the administration to be clearer about what they have in mind here. You rightly say this is under discussion, but what that means to me at this point is that no one knows exactly what it is that we plan to do here. And if no one knows here in the United States, if the American people don't know, if Kim Jong Un doesn't have some idea of what the response will be if he continues this testing, I think it's difficult for it to have any kind of deterrent effect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Ernst, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Admiral, thank you very much for being here today. I know the region is in a really precarious time and situation, but we do appreciate you taking time out to be with us. In a February speech, you warned the audience of the perils of linear thinking, saying instead that we need to think exponentially in order to develop strategies and technologies that give us an asymmetric advantage over regional threats. And I absolutely 100% agree with you. As chair of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, I'm very, very frustrated with the oftentimes slow and very, very expensive nature of our defense acquisitions. You've even said this. You said that Lady Gaga was able to use over 300 drones during her Super Bowl halftime show. And why is it that she has that technological advantage and we can't capitalize on that? How important is it that we are able to rapidly develop things like directed energy weapons and swarming micro drones? And more importantly, if we had these technologies today, will we have more and better options in order to manage threats that are posed by North Korea and China?
Yeah, so I think, Senator, that innovation is in general is one of those asymmetric advantages that America enjoys over every adversary. But we're in a place now where our adversaries recognize that, and they're trying to close that innovation gap. Mm-hmm. And they do it in a number of ways. They send their best and brightest students to American universities, and then they get educated here, and they go back home, and they carry that knowledge back to them. They also do it illegally. They steal our secrets. They steal our industrial processes, and they shorten their acquisition timelines dramatically. So they can field things at a rate faster than we can. And we're often encumbered, rightly so, by law, regulation, and policy. And I think that we should look at trying to figure out how to shorten that process. You know, the law is important, obviously. The regulations are important. Policy is important. But when the three in combination allow us to be overtaken in technological development by those countries that would do us harm, I think we should step back and look at that and ask ourselves, is this the right way forward? I'm pleased with things like the DIUX effort that's been undertaken by the department, the SCO effort, the Special Capabilities Office that resides in OSD to try to go flash to bang quicker, and things like that.
Thank you. And I do agree. I think it's important that we are able to move rapidly. And you are absolutely correct about the regulations and the laws. Great. They were there for a purpose, but we do have to go back and, I think, scrutinize some of those regulations to make sure that we're able to move as rapidly as some of our near-peer competitors, or even those that are not near-peer competitors with off-the-shelf technology. You mentioned ISIS in some of your comments, and in your testimony, of course, active engagement between the United States and our partner countries is very critical to maintaining the stability in that region, not just with those state actors like North Korea, but also with partners, engaging those partners in the fight against ISIS. If you could, can you speak to the importance of engaging some of those partners and how we are moving forward in that fight against ISIS?
Sure. So in the Indo-Asia Pacific, the countries that we work closest with in the ISIS fight are Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. And that's us, Australia, and New Zealand that are involved in this effort to work with those countries to help them fight that threat themselves. And the entity that does that for me is SOCPAC, Special Operations Command Pacific. And they are, Major General Brian Fenton and his team are actively engaged in providing advice and assistance to those countries, most principally right now in the Philippines, in the southern Philippines. So I'm encouraged by the work they're doing. I think it's God's work, and I'm pleased with where we are in that fight in the Indo-Asia Pacific.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Sullivan has to go to the floor to preside. Senator Hirono is graciously yielded. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleague, Senator Hirono from Hawaii. I very much appreciate the letting me jump ahead there. You know, in Alaska and Hawaii, we have a lot invested in this, as you know, Admiral, given that our citizens are going to be impacted sooner than anyone else with regard to the ballistic missile, intercontinental ballistic missile threat. Just want to begin by thanking you again for your service, Admiral. Would you agree that we're clearly in a more direct threat phase with regard to the North Korean challenge to our citizens?
I agree, Senator.
And you know, we were all over at the White House describing a strategy, integrated strategy that the administration is putting together with regard to very focused initially on enhanced diplomacy. But do you also believe that the threat of military force, or at least keeping it on the table, actually enhances our diplomatic efforts?
It does. I believe that the best enhancement to diplomacy is a strong military capability.
You mentioned the unprecedented weapons testing. I have a chart that I want you to take a look at, and also not if, but when North Korea will have a capacity to range the continental United States. So again, Hawaii and Alaska would be ranged earlier with the ICBM. The chart shows that Kim Jong Un has actually conducted more tests than his father and grandfather combined. Do you see that abating at all?
I do not see it abating at all if the trajectory remains as you have depicted on the graphic.
And he's learning even when he fails.
Right. Yeah, he is not afraid to fail in public.